excited to introduce our guests and share a little bit more about the National Asian American Survey. So the National Asian American Survey, or NAAS, is a scientific and nonpartisan effort to poll the opinions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on issues such as public policy, political preferences, experiences with discrimination, and race relations. And here with us today, we have two of the principal investigators and researchers from the NAAS, Jennifer Lee and Karthick Ramakrishnan. Jennifer Lee is a professor of sociology at Columbia University. She has written award-winning articles and books, including The Asian American Achievement Paradox, The Diversity Paradox, Asian American Youth, and Civility in the City. Committed to public engagement, she has written for and been featured in a variety of media outlets, including the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, CNN, and NPR. And then Karthick Ramakrishnan is an associate dean of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy and professor of public policy and political science. He directs the National Asian American Survey and is the founder of AAPIdata.com, which features demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. He's also written dozens of op-eds and appeared in over 1,000 news stories in many, many major outlets, including the New York Times, The Economist, Los Angeles Times, and CNN. So please welcome Jennifer and Karthick to the stage.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, everyone, for being here, both in person and remotely. There's a lot of ground that we're going to cover today, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. I'll be presenting primarily on API Data, which, as Amy mentioned, is a site that seeks to make data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders more accessible. What we've found in the last 4 years is that we've had tremendous influence in terms of raising the media profile and awareness among journalists of not only kind of general facts about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but also some of the complexity that we'll go over today. Jennifer will primarily be presenting from our latest National Asian American Survey, and then I'll conclude with some final data points. So first of all, just in the future, if you're interested in finding out more, please take a look at our website. We have a lot there. We have infographics. We do a fair amount of work through our infographics. We also have a feature called Quick Stats, which gives people access to data at various levels of geography on frequently requested tables from the Census Bureau. Given all the talent in the room here, I'd love to talk later about maybe ways that we can improve some of our quick stats features with the talent among folks at Google. The main takeaways of my portion of the talk is, first of all, to talk about the growing importance of Asian Americans, but to show that that growth in and of itself is limited because there's a big gap between what our numbers look like and where we stand in terms of leadership and civic engagement. And I'll submit to you that the problems of leadership and mobility within the corporate structure is related to our lack of visibility when it comes to civic engagement, and the solutions are linked as well. So first of all, in terms of talking about the growing importance of Asian Americans, some of you may be familiar with some of these statistics already. First is population growth. Whenever someone talks about why we need to pay attention to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we are among the fastest growing racial groups in the country. This was true from 2000 to 2010, and it's been true since 2010 as well. And much of this growth is fueled by immigration. So what we've seen since 2004, so over a decade, almost a decade and a half now, there have been more Asians that are coming in as legal permanent residents than Latinos coming in as legal permanent residents. Starting in 2007, a decade ago, there have been more Asian foreign-born coming into the United States than from any other region in the world, including Mexico and Central America. We've also seen a rapid increase in the Asian undocumented population. One of the things you may have seen this little factoid that 1 out of every 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented. That's something that we had done a lot of information work. We produced infographics and have done a lot of social media engagement on that, so much so that that talking point is now entering into the discourse in Congress among leaders in the Congressional APA caucus. And then finally, it might not be surprising at all to folks in Silicon Valley that Asian Americans are very dominant in the H-1B visa category, which is very much in the news today in terms of what the future of high-skilled immigration to the United States will look like. And it's not just Silicon Valley. When the travel ban first went into place, not only Google, Apple, Microsoft, and many tech companies had a very strong reaction because it would not only disrupt their business, but also went against the kind of core values of what inclusion meant within these corporate structures. But you also saw universities speaking up in ways that they had never spoken before, and quickly, because that also struck at the core of PhD programs, postdoctoral fellowships, and employment in professorships and other research positions. Medicine, too, has been very strongly affected by the kind of immigration changes, not only in terms of proposed legal changes, but executive actions that have happened in the last few months. So needless to say, we are now recognizing that Asians are an important part of the immigration story, although when it comes to undocumented immigration, most people still don't think of Asian Americans within their general conception of who the undocumented are. Please go to our website. We have a portion on undocumented immigration, which has some of these numbers in various states and also by national origin. Asian Americans are also an increasing share of the foreign-born. So even though we've had more Asians than Latinos coming in terms of inflows, the base population of who the foreign-born or who the immigrant population is still close to a majority Latino. But that's going to change, and by 2055, there'll be more Asian immigrants in the United States than Latino immigrants in the United States. And Asian Americans are also an important part of the immigrant vote. This is something that I try as often as I can when I speak to journalists, but even elected officials. Most people, when they think of immigrant voters, think Latinos. I can't tell you the number of times in which people make that easy assumption and switch between saying Latino and immigrant. But in fact, most Latinos in the United States, no matter how you measure them in terms of the resident population, in terms of the adult citizen population, in terms of the registered voter population, they're nowhere close to a majority immigrant. Right? Depending on the numbers, you're talking about 2/3 of the Latino population as native born. By contrast, Asian Americans are a predominantly immigrant population. So I keep saying when you talk about immigrants, you have to think about Asians. Then people say, well, but the Asian population is much smaller, right? So maybe it still makes sense when you talk about the composition of immigrants and immigrant voters to talk about them as predominantly Latino. But even there, the numbers show a very different story. Right? What we see at the national level, and in states like in states like California, it's actually you have more Asian immigrant voters than Latino voters. What you find is there are about as many Asian immigrant voters as Latino immigrant voters. So if someone's going to be intellectually honest and talk about the immigrant vote, they cannot just talk about the Latino vote. By the way, there's a decent number of white immigrant voters nationally as well. About a quarter of the immigrant population that is registered to vote is non-Hispanic white. What you'll see as a continuing theme in this presentation is that we need to go beyond stereotypes and look at the data and to educate and sometimes re-educate ourselves. I can't tell you the number of times, even when I look at the data, sometimes with different cuts, they surprise me because I'm not used to thinking of some of these populations in the way that the data reveal themselves. Quite apart from looking at the growing proportion of Asian Americans and their share of the immigrant population, other kinds of data that people usually use to say pay attention to Asian Americans look at their purchasing power. So Asian Americans by 2020 are going to be worth over $1 trillion in terms of purchasing power, on par with the African American and Latino populations in the US that are much larger. If you look at wealth generation, Asian Americans are expected to reach parity with the non-Hispanic white population in about 20 to 30 years. And in business formation, you see a pretty significant increase in the number of businesses that are owned by Asian Americans. So for all these reasons, we can say that we're growing in importance, we're becoming more visible, we're increasing in terms of purchasing power, wealth, et cetera. So what's the problem, right? Asian Americans seem to be doing pretty well. There does not seem to be a problem. Well, one problem is the model minority myth, which many of you may have heard, right? What I've shown you so far are aggregate statistics about the Asian American community, including on wealth. But if I showed you something on education, it would show you that Asian Americans actually have higher levels of educational attainment than the non-Hispanic white population. But when you take that aggregated data at the level of racial group, it often masks disparities. And there's significant disparities within the Asian category. This is what people call data disaggregation, right? Whenever you are able to get access to more fine-grained data, you can make better inferences. This should be pretty self-evident when you're talking about scientific analysis or social scientific analysis, but as I'll say in a second, it's actually become controversial recently. But without data, we cannot make our case. So if you look at educational attainment, even though Asians on average have the highest levels of educational attainment in the country, there are huge differences, right? So at the top, you have Taiwanese and Indian Americans that have the highest levels of those with a bachelor's degree and higher. By the way, Mongolian Americans have pretty high levels of educational attainment. And at the lower end of the spectrum, you have what have tended to be predominantly refugee populations, right? Vietnamese, Burmese, Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, and Bhutanese. And the gap is just enormous, right? From the low teens to about 3/4 of the population that has a bachelor's degree or higher. Within the Pacific Islander population, there are less differences, but you'll notice the scale has changed a bit, but the highest level of bachelor's degree attainment or higher is among the Melanesian population, which is about 1 in 5 have a bachelor's degree, right? Which is on the lower end of that scale when you're talking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders together. This is why data disaggregation is so vital. It's not just on educational attainment. If you look at limited English proficiency, right? Huge differences between Indians and Sri Lankans and Pakistanis who do not have as high language needs versus Bhutanese, Burmese, Vietnamese, Thai, et cetera, that have significant needs for translation and other kinds of assistance when it comes to dealing with officials, dealing with agencies that communicate predominantly in English. Now, we know that disaggregation is important, and yet recently, we've seen this in Rhode Island. This is something that is coming up in Massachusetts. It was a controversy that raged in California last year. We're seeing this as a controversy coming up in Minnesota, where you've had Asian American populations that for decades have been pushing for data disaggregation so they can get a better sense if you're talking about language assistance in terms of schools dealing with parents, if you're talking about language assistance when it comes to hospitals and what they need to provide at the local level. Data disaggregation has been central to advancing an Asian American agenda. What we found recently is a predominantly Chinese immigrant population that are mobilized largely through WeChat and other online networks have had a very skewed perspective of what data disaggregation means. And this arose out of California a couple of years ago, where someone convinced a bunch of people that if you're collecting this disaggregated data, it meant that you're going to have quotas on Chinese people in Berkeley and Harvard. That is not the intent nor the consequence of all of these data disaggregation pushes. These data disaggregation pushes were intended and designed and implemented to help disadvantaged populations, like the Hmong in Central Valley, right? Or the Cambodian population in Long Beach. But somehow, this has gotten sucked into the affirmative action debate, and that's something we can talk about later as well. And we've had a very skewed perspective. So this is from a protest in Rhode Island, and we've seen this elsewhere. And what's remarkable about these protests is the participants are very convinced of their cause without necessarily understanding what data disaggregation is about. And I find it a little sad, actually, and I'll editorialize a little bit here, to bring little children holding up signs saying, "I am American, and don't discriminate against me," right? Whereas the bill actually does nothing of the sort. I'll just point to that teenager who looks very uncomfortable, and the little girl in a stroller. Some people say that this is great. This is a sign of activism. This is a sign of the Asian American community empowering themselves. I think we need to re-examine what empowerment means. It's not just simply speaking up. It's actually having a sense of justice and knowing where we fit into the racial order. I know that some of these things will be controversial, and I invite conversation and discussion. So the lessons on data, one thing it does say to us, though, when we look at data disaggregation, is that we cannot just assume that just because our communities have been fighting for this, we've been fighting for this for over 30 years, to try to get government agencies to get more fine-grained data so we can have more effective public policy. Just because we've been fighting for it and convincing other people does not mean that the work is done. In fact, after all these policy victories have occurred, now we're seeing a new set of challenges, and we need to reach out both internally within the Asian American Pacific Islander population, but also externally to continually make the case. We can't just assume that once we've said something, that people get it. And on this, I'll quote Judge Mike Kwan, who's a Chinese American in Utah, who I think put it best in terms of some of the recent controversy, because many of the activists have been pushing hard against legislators, against people like Jennifer and I and others, saying that we're out to kind of exclude Asians, that what we're doing will introduce a new Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese internment. There are people who've been advocating for data disaggregation who've been called Nazis or employing Nazi tactics. Now, I'm not just using hyperbole here. These are verbatim things that you will hear on WeChat, on Twitter, and elsewhere. And I think Judge Mike Kwan put it best. Truth is the greatest casualty of the current times. Don't like the facts, just call them fake and ignore them. Don't like the messenger, call them stupid liars. The simple truth that every community advocate who's ever sought funding for the community knows is that data equals dollars. If you cannot demonstrate through data that a particular group is in need of assistance, they won't get any. So I'll just leave those words, and I'm, again, happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. So one, when we talk about the story of Asian Americans growing numbers and increasing in their wealth, it masks this enormous set of disparities within the population. The other problem is of low civic engagement. We generally do not vote in nearly the same numbers as the rest of the population, and it goes noticed, right? So if we don't participate, our economic contributions are not recognized. We are seen as a perpetual foreigner, and our leadership and talent hit a bamboo ceiling. So first, when it comes to our economic contributions, it's not just today that people recognize that Asian Americans are vital to our country's economy. So these are photos from California. One is of a Chinese miner around the time of the gold rush, and the other is of Chinese immigrants who are railroad workers, who are essential to building the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad and the benefits to the American economy do not become realized without the contribution of Asian immigrants, right? So we're so vital to the economic history of our country. And yet, when you look at the official portrait of the Golden Spike that united the western and eastern halves of the Transcontinental Railroad, there's not a single Chinese immigrant in sight. Right? So just because we're involved in the economy, that we might be vital to certain sectors in the economy, does not mean that we're going to get that recognition unless we're civically engaged. There's also a whole history of laws, starting out in California and then spreading to the rest of the country, where Asian Americans have been excluded, including Japanese Americans who were so vital to the agricultural sector in California. California passed an alien land law excluding Japanese, Indian, and other immigrants from owning land. And as we all know, Japanese Americans were interned in California and other parts of the United States because of their so-called perceived security threat. But this is not just history. Time and again, we've seen that when you have economic anxiety and scapegoating, we've seen an uptick in anti-Asian violence. So you have an image there from anti-Chinese riots in Denver in 1880, the Vincent Chin murder that many people, especially within the Asian American community, recognize and commemorate, and most recently, the brutal murder of Srinivas Kuchibhotla in Kansas, which the Asian American community is still, we would argue, not commemorating quite with the same fervor as we remember the Vincent Chin incident. In fact, if you look in 2017, this slide is actually based on incidents just in the first half of the year. Some very prominent incidents of of hate crimes against Asian Americans, predominantly targeting South Asians. And it's not just in terms of violence in society, right? So this is a very prominent individual, no longer in the White House. I don't know if people remember the context of this quote. This was Steve Bannon when he was the chief of Breitbart and speaking with then candidate Donald Trump. So this is in December 2015. And when Trump was saying that maybe not everyone should be sent back, that with some high-skilled immigrants, college graduates, they should remain in the country. And Bannon said, well, when 2/3 or 3/4 of CEOs in Silicon Valley are from South Asia or from Asia, first of all, by the way, that is totally false. It's a minuscule fraction of Silicon Valley CEOs that are Asian American, let alone South Asian. But here's another thing he says, and I think we should actually take this latter part very seriously. A country is more than an economy. We're a civic society. What Bannon means by that is actually an ethnic nationalist vision of what a civic society means. But there is this larger problem. If we're only seen as economic actors and not civic actors, it makes it very easy for those in power to exclude us from the civic sphere. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that with the RAISE Act, which proposes to cut family visas. Now, many Asian Americans, including Asian Americans that are highly skilled, might think, you know what, we're going to be okay, because we have high skills, and therefore Asian immigration is not going to be affected. Well, over half of Asian immigrants coming to the United States on legal permanent resident visas come in through family sponsorships. So it is going to affect us, including those that have high skills. Many of them depend on bringing relatives over to make a new life in the United States. Just recently, we put out a blog post in API Data and also created infographics showing how the proposed cuts to family visas would affect different populations. And as you can see, it would affect close to a majority of most detailed Asian origin groups, including Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese, Filipinos, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Vietnamese. Right, so this is an issue that is hot right now. We have to be engaged in. But it is rare. It is rare to see Asian Americans out in the streets. There were a set of actions that we helped to catalyze last week, but they were nowhere close to the kinds of actions that we've seen on the DREAM Act and other actions that Latinos have done on behalf of immigrant rights. So we absolutely need to speak up. Participation is key. It's key to building power. It's key to fighting racism. And quite honestly, per Steve Bannon, it's key to being seen as American. If we're not there in the civic sphere, people are not going to see us as part of the body politic. So we've got a lot of work to do. This is part of a speech that Barack Obama gave in 2016. And people generally were in a celebratory mood, including the president. He said, the API community is the fastest growing minority in America, but it's still like everyone's like clapping, everyone's excited. Well, that's good to cheer about. But it's still significantly underrepresented at the ballot box. In 2012, just 56% of eligible API voters were registered to vote. Now, the president wasn't just saying that to be a downer. There's a very realistic sense of where we stand. People know that we're important. People know that we're growing fast. But they also know that we underparticipate. It's not a secret, right? This is one of the things you get with data. People know. And especially elected officials know if you're a group that participates and if you're a group that doesn't. And we've seen that. We've seen that in voting data. Asian Americans vote at much lower rates than non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. It is also true in registration. So here's a different look at the data. And you see big differences within the Asian category in terms of what voting looks like and what registration looks like. Indian Americans tend to participate more than others, which is actually a little bit surprising given that they are among the most recently arrived to the United States, and we can talk more in the Q&A about why that might be the case. Chinese Americans have the lowest rates of voter registration and voter turnout. But it's not just voting. Asian Americans, as you'll see just above the bottom there, are much less likely than others to contact public officials. They're also much less likely to engage in boycotts, and they're the least likely to engage in protest activity. So even though many of us, including many Googlers, might have been involved in the various travel ban protests that occurred in January of this year, even when it comes to protest behavior, where so much of our interests are at stake, we are much less likely to do so than the rest of the population. So to sum up, we need to redefine Asian success. Many of us just think about economic success. Well, first of all, maybe even before economic success, many of us are socialized into thinking about GPA and academic achievement. And then maybe after that, wealth generation. But we need to redefine success to not only mean economic advancement, but also political participation, civic participation, and philanthropic activity. And the success not only of our community, but also larger society depends on it. Fortunately, we can draw upon the inspiration of many Asian American heroes and sheroes. So for example, Wong Kim Ark in 1898 helps establish the bedrock of birthright citizenship that every immigrant depends on, right? Which is that if your child is born in the United States, citizenship cannot be denied to that child. It was an Asian American who helped establish that. The first Asian American elected to Congress, Congressman Dalip Singh Sound, he had fought for the right for Indians and Filipinos to naturalize. And within 2 years of getting naturalized, he runs as a judge. And then after becoming a judge, he then runs for Congress and becomes the first Asian American elected to Congress. So we can draw upon all these inspiring stories, right? It is rare now when people get naturalized thinking, you know what, I'm going to vote in my next election, I'm going to run for judge, and I'm going to run for Congress. But we should look to those examples, right? And we have heroes from all of our different communities. This is one of the things. Many people think, you know what, our community is so diverse, it's hopelessly diverse. We can actually see diversity as a strength because every one of our groups have these inspiring examples, including Fred Korematsu, who fought the constitutionality of internment, or Larry Itliong, who is as important as Cesar Chavez to the establishment of United Farm Workers. And finally, we should look for inspiration not only within our community, but also with other marginalized communities, including other people of color. And I love this photo. This is a photo of Martin Luther King in Selma wearing Hawaiian leis, right? And this was a gift that was sent by Reverend Takaka to Martin Luther King to show the solidarity of Pacific Islanders with African Americans. And this solidarity remains as vital today as it did during the 1960s civil rights movement. It is important for us to recognize that our fates are interlinked, that if you talk about Asian American empowerment, it is fundamentally linked to the empowerment of other groups that are marginalized in this society. Thank you for your time, and I'll now switch it over to Jennifer Lee, who will talk about the National Asian American Survey.
Thank you, Karthik. I love that he added Shiros to the hero label. Thank you, Amy, for inviting us and for organizing this event. And thank you all for being here. And for those who are live streaming, we really appreciate the audience and we'd love to hear your feedback. What I'm going to do is switch gears a bit and talk about the National Asian American Survey and some of the data that's come from the National Asian American Survey. And just to underscore a few points, it was funded by a number of foundations without which it would not have launched. So the National Science Foundation has been a strong contributor, as has the Russell Sage Foundation, and our program director is in the audience, Aixa Cintron, and I wanted to thank her personally for her help. I wanted to start off by talking about what makes the National Asian American Survey unique. If you read newspapers and you see statistics, you see oftentimes percentages of what whites support policy, what percentage of white Americans support a particular policy, what percentage African Americans support a policy, or Latinos. What you often see missing is data on Asian Americans. And so what the National Asian American Survey does is help fill this substantive void to provide data on Asian Americans at the national level. What's unique about the Asian American Survey is that rather than focusing on just a couple of Asian ethnic groups, we choose 10. So the 6 largest, which are Asians, Asian Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, Vietnamese, Japanese. We also include Cambodian and Hmong, And we also include, for the first time, Bangladeshis and Pakistanis who have never been included in a national survey at all. What's also unique about the National Asian American Survey is that we conducted the survey in both English and in an Asian ethnic language. And why that's important, as Karthik mentioned, 2/3 of the Asian American population is foreign born, and many are limited in English language proficiency. The problem is that a lot of surveys that have been conducted in the past that focused on Asian Americans were only available in English. What that does is then bias the results to those who are English fluent and typically younger. And so we actually had the survey translated in a number of different languages. So let me begin by talking about some of the problems that Asian Americans face. As Karthik said, some of the rhetoric and some of the images of Asian Americans is that we are a highly educated, uniformly highly educated group, a high achieving group with high median household incomes. We're highly employed, we have high self-employment rates, that we're doing just fine, we're assimilating just fine, and on the way to becoming white, or at least honorary whites. So that is some of the dominant narrative, right? And so what are some of the problems that Asian Americans face? So we asked this question, and so at the top of the list was affordability of college, the cost of medical care, the cost of elderly care, and as you can see, a number of problems that Asian American respondents explained are problems. And in the actual, in our survey data, we have it broken down by ethnic group if you're interested. I wanted to point to a particular slide, which is bullying. So bullying apparently is a particularly strong problem among some Asian ethnic groups. If you look at the Hmong, for instance, 46% of Hmong Americans have listed bullying as a very serious problem. And it's Hmong, Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi. What's the pattern here? One of the things we're seeing in our data is this divergence of experiences between South Asians on the one hand and East Asians on the other. So it's not as though Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese don't experience bullying, but they're not experiencing it nearly at the same rate as South Asian Americans. And this gets to another point that Karthik and I found in our data that we actually we wrote about in an op-ed, which is that when we talk about Asian Americans, oftentimes Americans, not only white Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans, but also Asian Americans seem to have an idea of what Asian American is or who an Asian American is. And oftentimes we're thinking about East Asians exclusively. I mean, just to look at this audience is kind of interesting because Karthik and I were remarking that this is a talk about Asian Americans, but even this audience, the live audience, is predominantly East Asian. So there's something in the way we conceive of Asian Americans, there's something in the way that we're behaving that is creating this division and excluding South Asians from the fold. Why that's important is because when we talk about experiences with discrimination, with bullying, we're selecting a particular narrative and excluding certain groups. On that point, I wanted to talk about some experiences with discrimination that have come up in our survey. So the first is with police. Again, what we see is a different set of experiences between Cambodian, Indian, Hmong, Pakistanis, who are South Asians, versus Koreans, Chinese, Vietnamese. That South Asians are more likely to have had negative experiences with the police than East Asians. If we look at the question of whether anyone has felt that they've been unfairly denied a promotion, we see a different pattern emerging. We see that among Asian Americans more generally, 14% attest that they feel like they've been unfairly denied a promotion. But if you look at the groups who respond even more highly, it's Filipinos and Indians. And why this is interesting is that these groups tend to be more likely represented as white-collar professionals. And so is it possible that those who are more likely to be in mixed settings, in professional settings, are more likely to experience the bamboo ceiling, so to speak. And so this is something that Karthik and I are working on, trying to understand not only the figures about who feels they've been unfairly denied, but what are some of the mechanisms that are suppressing advancement among Asian Americans. And just to give you a statistic, among Asian American college-educated males, when you hold all things constant, like where they went to school, their major, where they live, all sorts of a host of factors, they make 8% less than white males who are comparable on every scale. Asian American women earn as much as white women, but they're less likely to be in supervisory positions, so they're less likely to be promoted to the managerial ranks. So even when you attain the right degrees, even if you go to the right school, even if you have the right experience, that for some reason we're not doing as well in the labor market as we should. Another thing that came up, about 1/5 of Asian Americans report that they receive poor service in restaurants and stores. And again, you see an interesting pattern where Filipino, Hmong, Indian, Bangladeshi are more likely to report this as a problem than other Asian ethnic groups. This, I think many of us have experienced at one point in our lives. For how many have you received a comment that people are either surprised that you speak English or surprised that you speak English well? So that is at least half here, and you're Googlers. So I presume that all of you are fluent in English. But so about 30% of Asian American respondents report that people act as if they don't speak English. And again, you see variation among the groups. And this is a theme that Karthik and I will continue to speak about, that on the whole, there is tremendous diversity among Asian Americans, yet at the same time, there's a similar pattern that emerges. This is another thing that I think many of us have experienced, that you've had your name mispronounced. How many people have had their name mispronounced at some point in their lives? So much so that I'll just draw on my own experience. So my first name is a Korean name. It's Ji-young. When I became naturalized, I don't even know if Karthik knows this story. When I became naturalized, I had the choice to add a middle name. And so I added Jennifer because I was actually very tired of having to say my first name over and over again, or have a substitute teacher come in and stop at my name and pause. Yet if you think about Ji-young, it's not phonetically difficult. And if you think about it, we work really hard to say white ethnic names that seem impossible to pronounce, yet for some reason, Asian ethnic names are difficult to pronounce and people don't even try. So again, about 2/3 of Asian Americans have experienced this, particularly Indians and Japanese. This is another thing that I suspect many people in the audience have experienced, that people assume because you're Asian, you're good at math and science. And so I'd love to see a show of hands of how many have experienced this. So math and science are not my particular forte, actually, but I think most people assume that I'm good at math and science, and people assume that most Asians are good at math and science. Again, these are perceptions, and this might seem like a positive stereotype in some ways, but one of the things that Karthik and I will write about and are writing about is that in some ways, when you're perceived to be so good at technical skills, oftentimes you're also perceived to lack social skills, or so-called soft skills, that are needed for leadership positions. I wanted to go on and talk a little bit more about some of the opinion data. So oftentimes Asian Americans are perceived as just caring about education, just getting into the top schools. But we have strong opinions about public policies. We're very strongly against a Muslim ban, and this is uniform across groups. About 2/3 of Asian Americans are against a Muslim ban. that Trump has proposed. Asian Indians evince the strongest opposition. Almost 80% are against the Muslim ban. We also strongly and somewhat agree that undocumented immigrants should have a pathway to citizenship. That on the question of undocumented immigrants, Asian Americans agree that there should be a pathway, and our numbers are very much in line with those of white, Black, and Latino Americans. Latino is a little bit higher, actually. This is another slide that I thought was very important to point out, which is that one of the things that oftentimes gets enmeshed in the debate about affirmative action is this idea that Asian Americans only care about themselves. But one of the things we find is that 72% strongly support that the government do more to ensure equal rights between Black and white Americans. This is an incredibly high percentage, and in some ways it even surprised me. But I think this underscores the point that we are a multifaceted group, that we care more than just about getting in the right colleges. We care more than about just getting the right jobs, that we have very diverse set of interests that are not oftentimes profiled in the media. We're also very committed to climate change and environmental issues, again, which is something that the media does not particularly point out about our population. Since I'm running out of time, actually, just is perfect, I'm going to hand it back over to Karthik, who's going to talk about the presidential vote choice.
And I'll just say this very quickly. Thank you, Jennifer. We also have data on how Asian Americans voted. And in fact, it's different from what the exit polls show, which were not done in Asian languages. It was only done in English and Spanish. Well, I'll get to that in a second. One thing about 2016 is that it was a record-setting year for Asian Americans. So we doubled our normal increase in terms of the increase in Asian American voters per presidential cycle. In terms of how Asian Americans voted, across the board, Asian Americans favored Clinton over Trump, although there are some significant differences. Before we surveyed Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, it used to be that Indian Americans were among the bluest of Asian Americans, but maybe not surprisingly, given the role of anti-Muslim rhetoric in the election this year, and given the fact that Bangladeshi and Pakistani Americans are predominantly a Muslim population here, that they showed the highest level of support for Clinton. Still, we have a fair number of Asian Americans who do not identify as either Democrat or Republican, although that's a 3-point partisan scale. What political scientists do is they take people who say that they're independent and ask them, are you closer to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? Overall, we see that the Democratic Party has a pretty strong advantage, except among Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cambodian Americans. And among Chinese Americans, actually, we're seeing a shift, perhaps related to some of the conservative activism that we've seen in the last few years, but potentially other broader demographic trends in which we're seeing a rightward shift among Chinese American voters. And then finally, even though Asian Americans are growing and they're getting more active, we've had a record increase in Asian American voters, Asian Americans are still much less likely to be contacted by parties. And this sets up a bit of a catch-22. Parties are more likely to contact those that are registered with the party, consistently vote, and have strong party identification. Asian Americans tend to index low on that compared to the non-Hispanic white and Black populations. But party contact itself also increases all of those things. Right? So just like you have a virtuous cycle among whites and African Americans where more contact means more engagement, Asian Americans seem so far to be trapped in a vicious cycle of less contact, less engagement, less subsequent contact. And we need to find out ways to break out of this cycle. So I'll end with that, and if Jennifer can join me up here, we'll take some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. So we have 2 mics in the audience for
This
live
is
questions.
Kaya.
And so if you have a question, go ahead and stand up and ask. But the first question that I kind of want to get a sense of is, you mentioned that you believe the model minority myth is one of the biggest challenges facing our community. What are some ways we can think about combating it?
So someone actually tweeted at me because I tweeted that we were speaking at Google, And so this gets to the model minority thing. This is something that Google can do. So this is like civic engagement live in action. Jason Fong, who, by the way, started blogging when he was a high schooler, and he's a freshman at Wesleyan now. And he says, "Professor, please tell Google that its definition of Asian Americans as being chiefly East Asian is inaccurate." If you guys look up Asian American definition in Google, it uses something, I don't know from what dictionary, but it says, actually I'll read this out right now. And it says, an American who is of Asian, and then in parentheses, chiefly East Asian descent. This is important because if you look at the demographic data, less than 40% of the Asian American population now is East Asian. The reason why I bring this up is that our model minority myth, but also our notion of who is Asian is kind of frozen in time and very, very stereotypical. And it hurts us, even though we think it might be a compliment to be seen as good in math and science. It means that people who have creative talent are less likely to have that talent recognized. And so I think what can be done, part of it is changing even the stories we tell ourselves as Asian Americans, but also continually showing our complexity and not shying away from showing those parts of ourselves that are not in line with that model minority myth. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have
I would say one other thing is that Karthik and I wrote about when there was the shooting of Kuchibhotla. One of the things we both noticed was that there wasn't the outcry among Asian Americans as there was with Vincent Chin. And Vincent Chin, his murder was 35 years ago, and still every year that comes up and that becomes heralded as an issue that in some ways unifies us. That didn't happen most recently. It hasn't been happening when it comes to South Asians who are much more likely to experience hate crimes and discrimination. And here I would think that we are much stronger when we unify across ethnic groups. We experience similar types of discrimination, and how much more powerful we can be if we decide, at least among ourselves and also collectively, show a stronger collective unifying identity that Asian American includes not only East Asian, but also South Asian, who are demographically actually becoming a larger part of our population, as Karthik mentioned.
Yeah, one quick thing, if I may, Amy, it's just February 2018. Let's see what Google, other Silicon Valley companies, and Asian Americans throughout the country can do to commemorate that anniversary, because the effects of that still reverberate. So his widow had her visa status was in jeopardy because her sponsorship had expired with her husband's death, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to, this stuff is so powerful, and the fact that we are not rising up and speaking up actually makes it more likely that policies will get passed that disadvantage our communities.
I really appreciate the themes coming out of you sharing around community and coming together as a community. But what we're also seeing are some very real nuances in the data around opinions of different ethnic groups. So I'm curious around your thoughts and ideas for how do we move forward as a collective community, recognizing as well the diversity that exists, like the vast diversity.
So I'll start, and then Jennifer, you can. So one of the, people who are not Asian kind of get confused. You're like, wait, you say that you're Asian, but then you also say we're very different and don't lump us all together. And it's like, it's hard. How can you be one and many at the same time? And the academics in us would say it's complicated, but we can't just say that, right? So part of it is contextual. So yes, there are vast socioeconomic differences, but when it comes to public opinion, on a bunch of public opinion data, Asian Americans, so for example, on the Affordable Care Act, on universal health care, on the Muslim ban, and a bunch of other issues are actually pretty unified. So so data disaggregation does not mean that these groups will never come together on anything. But it's only when you disaggregate the data as you can tell what are the circumstances under which this group is very different from each other, what are the circumstances under which they're unified. So we need to have an evidence-based approach to this question and not something that's just based on stereotyping.
I would also say one other thing, which is that if we look at the Latino community, there is enormous diversity among Latinos. There are Cubans, there are Mexicans, there are Guatemalans, Salvadorans, enormously different achievement outcomes, enormously different migration experiences, yet as Latinos, they are a powerful political force. And so that's what I think we're missing as Asian Americans. Just because we identify as Asian and we take an inclusive approach does not mean that we deny our ethnic origins or national origins, but the power that we have as Asian Americans is much stronger as a collective, just as Latino is much stronger than Cuban.
Thank you. And I believe we have a live question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was just really curious about the sample size that you collected to gather this data, and how did you decide on the questions that were prompted? Like, if you were bullied, which are you leaning more towards, Republican or Democrat? And all of the questions that you mentioned. So I'm just really curious the methodology a little bit more.
Excellent. Yeah. So this is I think the overall sample size is a little over 4,000 for Asian Americans.
I think 4,300.
4,300. There you go.
Yes.
We try to get at least 300 per group, just in terms of the statistical power that we need for most of the kind of differences that we see. In terms of the questions, it's layered. Some of it is repeating questions that show up in other major national science-funded surveys, like the American National Election Study and the General Social Survey. Some of it is also questions that we've asked in the past based on conversations with community organizations. So the question about bullying is part of this larger set of questions about the challenges that people face for themselves and their families. And so we're repeating some of those questions to track it over time.
Yeah, and I would say that what's interesting is that when you have four principal investigators, we come with different interests, and the three of them are actually political scientists, and I'm a sociologist, and maybe that doesn't make a huge difference to you, but we have very different ideas of what are important questions. And like Karthik said, part of NAAS was to fill a substantive void. People were not surveying Asian Americans, and so we had no idea how Asian Americans stood on certain issues. So some of that is just the questions that were asked of other Americans, but were not asked of Asian Americans, and then other questions were built thinking about the unique experiences and challenges of Asian Americans.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, by the way, is not only in this survey, but in prior surveys, both that NAAS has done, but also AAPI data has done, we've uncovered other issues. Environmentalism is one of them. Most people, when they think about environmentalists, don't think of Asian Americans, but we actually index much higher than the US average when it comes to pro-environment attitudes. Gun control, we have some of the strongest attitudes that are pro-gun control. But Asian Americans rarely get talked about. Like after Vegas, how many people were asking, where do Asian Americans stand? Right? But the fact that we have this data hopefully can help change that narrative. So that we are written into the stories of what Americans think about gun violence and gun control.
Thank you for that question. I'd love to hear if there are notable differences, talking about survey data, between the first generation and second generation that emerged from the NAAS data. If you saw any patterns there, do young Asian American adults differ in their views on policy issues than, say, compared to older Asian American adults?
Actually, I'll start off with that. I think I'm so glad you asked that question because we have so much more data than we're able to present in this short period. And if you're interested, you can look at the link that's listed below. One of the most interesting things is that if you break down the data by generational status, so first generation meaning born in a different country, second generation born here, and also if you break it down by age, so 25 and under versus 25 and up, the younger second generation are incredibly more progressive on all of these issues. So Asian Americans are much more progressive on all of the issues that we discussed, which is oftentimes a misperception. But if you look at the 25 and under, and if you look at the second generation, they're actually even more progressive about the Muslim ban. They oppose it more strongly. They're more likely to support a pathway to citizenship. They're more likely to support climate control, gun control, all of the issues. It's really actually quite, it feeds me with a sense of optimism about where we're going as a community.
Yeah, the one caveat I'll say, though, is when it comes to participation, so
Yes.
all you Asian American millennials in the room and
Yes.
online, we need to step up our game, right? Because
Yes.
it used to be, so when we were looking at this puzzle, Asian Americans, on average, tending to have among the highest levels of educational attainment, but the lowest levels of political participation. That's a huge puzzle. The political science and sociology literature would not predict that. So what accounts for that? Generally, we found immigration-related factors. Turns out that most people got their college degrees in Asia. They were not socialized into politics in the same way. They don't understand the party system. They don't understand the issues. They're not as engaged. So that should mean that the people born here, who went to college here, who are progressive in all these, or even maybe they're conservative on a bunch, they have strong opinions on issues, they should be engaged. And again, Asian American millennials, Asian American native born have among the lowest rates of political and civic participation. That really concerns me. If we think about what, especially in a state like California, if you look at the future of California, and especially its professional upper middle class population, it's more and more going to be Asian American. What are we doing to hold up our end of the civic commitment to the state of California, to the neighborhoods we live in, and to our country? I think it's a big question, it's a big challenge, and it's something hopefully that all of us can have a role in helping to shape the future.
I certainly hope so. So we'll take one more live question, and then I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I know we're a couple minutes over, but want to give space for this one last question.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming today and sharing all of this illuminating information. Related to the last question, instead of just being participants in terms of like accepting this information and kind of letting it sink in, what are 2 or 3 actions that we can take to all be part of that change that you've mentioned today?
Well,
Go
I'll
for it,
start.
Karthik.
Yeah, I mean, this is hard work. I mean, so we tried working with different community organizations through the country to say, you know what, Asian Americans, are, especially on something like immigration, not just on DACA and Dreamers, but with the proposed cuts to legal immigration that the president just announced, we should be up in arms. We're so heavily engaged in digital media. We should be flooding Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat with what we think. Many of us would not be in this country given the new kind of qualifications they're talking about under the RAISE Act. So one of the simple things we can do, so we had come up with this hashtag called AAPI Action. And I would humbly suggest, maybe not, maybe that hashtag, maybe something else, but let's start getting organized digitally because we're so heavily indexed in terms of digital participation, but let's go beyond consumption, right? Of like our YouTube stars and like questions about who we are. Like these identity questions are important, but we have to be engaged in digital and social media. So that's one easy thing.
Right here. I think one of the things is you may have seen a lot of hashtags about Hollywood is so white. And we are up in arms about the lack of diversity in Hollywood, in movies and TV, the lack of Asian American representation. If we could channel that energy to some political causes, as you mentioned, how much stronger would we be? How much more seriously would we be taken?
And the last thing I would say is, let's see what we can do in February 2018. I'm serious here. That would be a good, and we have several months of lead time, right? This is the 1-year anniversary of Srinivas Kuchibhotla's murder. It was also the 1-year anniversary of the gentleman who helped save his life, right? So it also shows you the power of cross-racial coalitions and standing up for each other. Let's see what we can do, because I think that will be a good test of we have enough lead time to organize. This is someone who is an engineer, so that should be a cause that should be near and dear to the heart of engineers everywhere, right? But even beyond engineers. And this is something that all APIs should rally around because it shows you the power of anti-immigrant rhetoric, racist rhetoric, and nativism, and how it can affect all of us in very dangerous ways. And it's important for us to not only commemorate, but to make sure that things like this don't happen again. So I'll leave it at that as one potential test to what our power could be, both in terms of online activism as well as offline.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being here, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate your attendance and engagement, and thank you both.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.